The next Stagverse episode is planned to feature a video that's so obnoxiously dense in issues and repetition that it requires a full-length breakdown just so I can figure out how to go about structuring, and with how frustrating said video is, I was more than happy to find something much smaller and digestible to cover as a little distraction. So the concept goes as such. Professor Dave made a video to attempt at explaining transgenderism. The F-Tator, who will be referred to as F-Worm, would commentate on that, particularly citing that the claim that gender is not a social construct to be an incorrect statement. This was followed up by a one-shot commentary from Starmic, in what I believe was an attempt to explain an error in F-Worm's argument in their eyes. And finally there's the video I'm covering, F-Worm's response to Starmic. Before we get into it, I just want to voice a little concern. F-Worm, you were able to get this response out in the span of 24 hours. I grant you it's on a one-shot, so it's not particularly something that requires a significant amount of effort, but this is a bit of a red flag personally. However, a commentary lives or dies by its execution and arguments, so let's get into those.
Content warning. The following interjection will have mentions of Reiko. If you wish to avoid hearing of her, you may skip to the next chapter or the timestamp on screen. She is not mentioned or relevant in any other part of the video. Apologies for the inconvenience.
Welp, the fire background can only mean one thing. I'm covering a commentary on me again. This time from a user named Starmic. And let me just say, when his channel description not only praises, but also dead names Ray, I do not have very high apple pie in the sky hopes going into this, just so you guys know.
You're looking at things improperly. Examples? The name next to it. Annabeth Wide, as in the previous username of Bubbling Brook? Yes, I believe this description is what we in the business call old, and likely made before Way publicly identified under that name. There's also the issue with you saying Starmic plays his Way, when that description says they were inspired by her. Those are completely different concepts. The former is expressing warm approval, whilst the latter focuses on how they were motivated to create something. Maybe you can argue they feel related when you deconstruct them, however, both concepts would be talking about her work as a commentator. Are you looking to say your expectations are affected because Way inspired them to make commentaries? Why is Way the focus of your ire when she wasn't the only name mentioned? Does this have more to do with the fact that Way has done things that are, to be vague but blunt, criminal? That's ultimately irrelevant. 1. The description is still old and likely not indicative of any recent feelings they may have towards Way. 2. The concept of separating the art from the artist is a valid opinion. And 3. Turning out to be a shit person doesn't mean Starmic couldn't be inspired by Way. As someone else who credits Way as one of his inspirations, I'm not going to act like she wasn't someone that motivated me to make commentaries, even after denouncing her. And all of this is ignoring how irrelevant bringing up the channel description is in the grand scheme of things. The only reason I even stayed on this so long was to rationalize why it would even be mentioned. At best, this is an unneeded dig at them because they hadn't updated the description. At worst, a whale poisoning tactic. Next time it'd benefit us all if you just kept things impersonal and cut to the video.
Now, as promised, with the indictment of conservatives complete, I turn to liberals and the missteps they are enacting that are preventing resolution. Number 1, please stop saying things like gender is a social construct.
So, quick question to you, Professor. If the societal attitudes and roles created as a result of the observation of one's sex isn't a social construct, then what is it exactly? For that matter, if this is the case, then why have the concepts of masculinity and femininity differed so much throughout history? Just 1 century ago, pink was considered a masculine color and blue was considered a feminine color. Today, it's the exact opposite in most of the West. At this same point in history, white dresses were entirely gender neutral, as was the term girl, which simply referred to a young child, who would later turn into either a man or a lady. High heels are considered feminine in the West today, but once upon a time, they were actually invented for the purpose of archery, and were later co-opted by the aristocracy as a sign of wealth. A man who has sex with a lot of women today is considered to be a playboy or a pickup artist or something else along those lines, but in ancient Rome, he would have been considered unmasculine. In fact, in a lot of the 20th century, homosexuality was considered effeminate. In ancient Rome, having sex with women was considered feminine, and having sex with men was considered masculine.
Well, if you wanted my sources, I'll give you them.
I appreciate the gesture, but this is poorly done. You don't cite the sources properly. Your descriptions under both your videos don't have any links to the external sources you mention. The sources themselves are wide, I guess. Though there's a secondary issue in this where you're unable to recall where you pick up your particular examples on the Roman societal roles on gender, and then ramble about other related details without citing them whatsoever. And your excuse for them being based on common knowledge is honestly quite flimsy. I'm not going to say every single thing that comes out of your mouth requires a citation, but if you try to base an argument on anything that would require some sort of outside knowledge, giving your audience a resource to view for themselves would not only be helpful for the sake of education, but also to allow them to check your work and reach an understanding as to where your logic is coming from. A task you should probably be more wary of, as one of the demographics for your content is going to be other commentators that will look politically into your work. Failing to do that only gives them reason to doubt you. On a side note, this is also an issue with Professor Dave's content, particularly his video that started the chain, and doubly so since he wants to be seen as a good resource for self-education. Handing out some well-needed citations would do a lot better than believing your audience will just hang to your words without question.
Afromentator, he never said that societal attitudes and roles created as a result of the observations of one's sex isn't a social construct, because Dave himself already established his own definition of gender which doesn't include any of that, so this tangent doesn't really work here.
Okay, what is it with people who cover me and thinking I don't know the videos I cover? Because this is the second time this has happened.
That's a little presumptuous of you to say, F1. It's just a counter-argument to what you said, but they felt your statement was not arguing what was said. Why are you assuming Starmic believes you weren't paying attention? Please avoid doing that. This might seem innocuous, but this particular reaction will be relevant for my final thoughts.
I'm perfectly aware that Dave attempted to give his own definition of gender. However, there are two issues with your claim that therefore makes my tangent incorrect. The first one being, I reject his definition of gender because it's utterly nonsensical. The most he gave was that it's complicated, which isn't a definition.
I mean, sure, saying something is complicated isn't a definition, but it's also not what he said. How he defined it was as a neurochemical phenomenon, which simply states it's a part of what your brain thinks. He mentions it being more complicated as an add-on, but he says that because he follows that statement by bringing up how researchers are still looking into the biological basis of gender identity.
Gender is a different phenomenon. It is still biological, but it is a neurochemical construct. This means that ultimately it is still genetic in basis, but it absolutely is not determined merely by the sex chromosomes. It is tremendously more complicated, and researchers are still working to understand the biological basis of gender identity. Human psychology is complex. People need to deal with that.
It wasn't meant to hand-wave away the definition as just complicated. It was given one. This one that also has more going on and still requires some work.
There's also the fact, and this is something else I point out in the commentary, that his definition was essentially pulled out of his ass. It's something he made up on the spot so he could redefine gender in a specific way, basically just so he could say that it's not a social construct. Using the actually universally accepted definition of gender shows that it is. And that's what I was using when I was responding to him.
What? No, F1, why would you come to that conclusion? Why would Dave be intentionally dishonest with his definition just for that point? That is such a big leap in logic and a huge accusation, and is also not something inferred from your commentary. In your original video, your response to his definition was that you never heard of it.
Gender is a different phenomenon. It is still biological, but it is a neurochemical construct.
I have, and I mean this with no hyperbole, never heard anybody say this before. In fact, I actually looked up neurochemical gender, and the first thing I found was a Cornell University article from 2000, which says that neurochemicals could be the reason why men and women act differently as opposed to gender, because gender is typically defined as the social constructs created based around being a man or being a woman in the eyes of society.
To say he was writing it off as confusing.
This means that ultimately it is still genetic in basis, but it absolutely is not determined merely by the sex chromosomes. It is tremendously more complicated, and researchers are still working to understand the biological basis of gender identity.
So, in the video called Let's End All This Confusion About Trans People, your explanation of gender is, I don't know, man, it's really confusing.
Which, wow, that was actually a really stupid point on your part. And then when he elaborates, specifically on how it's based on how we think and feel, you simply ask for a citation under the hypothetical of being someone who was skeptical.
Human psychology is complex. People need to deal with that. Thoughts and feelings are ultimately chemical phenomena. We all have a neurochemical profile that guides how we think and feel, and part of that is gender identity.
Source, citation, anything that would make me believe this claim if I was even slightly skeptical of it? No, nothing. Well, okay.
Which is fail, as I pointed out earlier, but you would have had a significantly better counterpoint if you focused on the lack of citations, which would intrinsically lead to you doubting the validity of his claims, over trying to say he made up a new definition to push a narrative in his favor, something that he has no reason to do, barely benefits him in any way, and also something you just don't have evidence for. Occam's razor F1. You benefit so much from applying it to your reasoning. If you want to argue the lack of sources shows he made it up, 1. Look in the mirror, or more specifically your own descriptions, and reevaluate that stance. And 2, there's a such thing as an opinion, which you can express to challenge a more popular sentiment. You know, present an argument. I don't understand how you could jump to this huge accusation on a topic that is quite harmless on its own. Now I'm done with that argument, but there's still another problem with not just this point, but the entire interjection as a whole. To start, we need to play Starmic's actual point in full.
He never said that societal attitudes and roles created as a result of the observations of one's sex isn't a social construct because Dave himself already established his own definition of gender which doesn't include any of that, so this tangent doesn't really work here. Whether or not Dave's idea of gender holds water, we already know where his premise for the claim that gender is not a social construct stems from anyway, since if his idea was true that gender is based on brain chemicals then gender wouldn't be a social construct.
I played that in full because I want to make it clear that F1 separated Starmic's first point to argue in a vacuum, which led to him making an interjection that was worthless. The fact you reject Dave's definition of gender? Irrelevant. The fact you believe he pulled it out of his ass? Irrelevant. The fact you are arguing with the universal definition of gender? Which you kinda won, but we'll get there. Irrelevant. Even your summarization of Starmic saying your use of the definition of gender was incorrect shows how off-base these points are. The actual point was that your counter to Dave didn't matter because you both argued in different concepts of what gender means. Even if you're correct, you don't address Dave's actual logic of how gender as he defines it, and how said logic would disprove the notion of gender being a social construct. If you don't want to address things under his logic, then this part should have just been skipped. Because if you find the concept of how Dave defines gender to be wrong, you're absolutely not going to find any concept he pushes with that same definition in mind to be valid. And as you already addressed his definition as incorrect, you would retroactively disprove arguments like him saying gender is a biological construct. So it'd just be padding to address it forward. However, that's not even getting into how the point you made has an additional flaw that Starmic plans to show. But alas, we need to get there first. I still haven't addressed your response to the second half of Starmic's point.
Whether or not Dave's idea of gender holds water, we already know where his premise for the claim that gender is not a social construct stems from.
Yeah, and I don't accept his notion, hence why I was ignoring it for this point. Here's a question, Starmic. If I were to commentate on an alchemist, would I be required to respond to his methods of turning lead into gold in a way that accepts the idea that you can do that?
No, what they're saying is if you're gonna commentate on an alchemist, you would need to address the actual problems with their methods of turning lead into gold over outright ignoring it simply because it doesn't fit reality. You remember that we're also here under the principles of debate, correct? F1, if you're going to go after what you feel is pseudoscience, you do have to address things on their level to an extent. Because a lot of pseudoscience is based on some form of belief from an established party of some degree, and can entice a lot of uninformed people who just don't know any better, addressing it for what it is and debunking it through counter research is how you can stop these concepts from spreading. You never did declare it as pseudoscience. You, at worst, were showing that you had no reason to believe him. And it's not like there isn't a basis for what Dave says. You point out that there was an article about neurochemical gender in your video, which has existed since February 2000, so this has been floating around for some time. And alternatively, as I was looking up this article under your methods, I ran across an article from the National Library of Medicine entitled Neurobiology of Gender Identity and Sexual Orientation. An article that, while had a number of shortcomings, showcases enough evidence that there was a significant biological contribution to someone's gender. I don't showcase this to turn the tides because something this complex would deserve more than just one article to do so, and believing otherwise is a very dangerous precedent. My point is more so a roundabout take to my previous points about you overstepping what your original video accomplished and making more claims than you should have. I reiterate, you should have just focused on the lack of citations. The extra bullshit is not helping you.
But that's not the biggest problem here actually. Fun fact, I watched Professor Dave's video before this commentary existed and I remembered a point where Professor Dave mentions gender roles and gender expectations.
Gender roles are a social construct. That all men must be this way and do these things, and all women must be this way and do these things. That is a social construct, and it is one that became obsolete immediately upon evolving beyond a hunter-gatherer society. It has only persisted due to deeply rooted misogyny and the desire to treat women as private property. Rage against gender roles as a social construct all you like. I'm right there with you. But stop saying that gender itself is a social construct.
In Dave's eyes at least, everything you described here would fall under gender roles and gender expectations, in which you yourself implied with the statement societal attitudes and roles created as a result of the observations of one's sex. So yeah, your point here fails since we know he believes those things are a social construct. What's suspicious here is that this part of his video is completely cut out from your commentary. It can come across as dishonest, so make sure not to do this in the future. I'm not going to accuse you of doing anything malicious, as it could just be an oversight, or maybe I'm completely off base here.
You're not going to say that I did it for malicious reasons, you're just gonna heavily imply it. It was suspicious, after all, but not malicious, not malicious. No, nobody said it was malicious.
So we're going to ignore what Stomach actually says, like how they say you cutting out context can be seen as dishonest, inferring it's not an absolute nor applicable in your case, but also how after they clarify they don't believe what you did to be malicious, such as how they say it could simply be an oversight, or that they're in the wrong for believing such, so we can interpret the least charitable response possible. F1, may I ask why you chose to be Nekogoto for this moment? We could probably debate whether you cutting out the context that fucks your point over should be seen as dishonest. Personally, I like giving you the benefit of doubt, but what you just pulled, that was dishonest. GG.
But to tell you why I cut it out, it's because, to be honest, I didn't have anything to say about it. Although, looking back, I really should have said something about it, because that doesn't make any sense considering gender roles flow from gender. Saying that gender is not a social construct, but gender roles are, is essentially on the same level as saying that 2 plus 2 is biological, but 4 is a social construct. That doesn't make any sense.
Oh my god, a couple of things. Since we're arguing with his definition in mind for once, I don't understand how you would claim it wouldn't make any sense when the two, while connected, wouldn't be synonymous. To make a comparison that makes some fucking sense, let's use sexual orientation. It's pretty well accepted that your sexuality is something ingrained in you, based on feelings, and can be considered biological, but our society has its own views on the differing orientations based on our observations of couples within the groups. Let's also use race. That's definitely biological, and our society also has its own views on the races based on observations of them in groups. Gender would simply be exactly like those, and it's not particularly reliant on gender roles either. In fact, this is probably the best opportunity to discuss you relying on gender roles for the definition of gender. It's not particularly accurate. When people discuss gender, the main topic in the forefront is usually gender identity. If I may take from a source I mentioned since it happened to have a reasonably accurate definition, gender identity refers to a person's innermost concept of self as male, female, or something else, and can be the same or different from one's physical sex. The reason why focusing on gender identity over gender roles is better comes from some fairly agreed upon notions. A person's gender should be determined and decided by themselves, not by society's views on the sexes. Gender roles have been used in the case of certain groups, but that normally be applicable to cisgender people who likely have no strong feelings about their gender or sex and who are not relevant to the discussion anyway, and those in traditional cultures, which is a totally different discussion entirely. Gender roles are also stringent and don't account for those that express themselves outside of the concepts. From those that go against that, like feminine men and masculine women, those that cross-dress, and those that prefer androgyny, to those with trans identities not congruent with the binary, non-binary people, genderqueer, gender fluid, and agender people. The norms in which our society looks at those that are male and female doesn't account or influence them. In fact, it's caused them harm and negatively impacted their lives. That's a confusing thing about your counterpoint I picked up on. One of your earlier points in your commentary on Dave was about how he erased trans people from the discussion of his video, and you would later define gender under the subset that erases trans identities. I don't get it. I groaned when I finished this video. I rewatched your commentary on Dave, and I remember one of the last things you said being that you prefer to argue statements on their own merit. Hence why I was a tad miffed with this video, where you preferred to effectively shut down a talking point, as if you had debunked it and proven it to be pseudoscience. Your original video didn't do that. It's like to call out Dave for making the discussion of trans people more confusing, making out points from two separate parties to attempt debunking them, and arguing established concepts with different ideas without any sources. If you wanted to say Dave's definition of gender was pseudoscience, you failed to demonstrate that. On top of your definition of gender being flawed, it was a tangent that just wouldn't argue his statement on two levels. Something you didn't address because you were more focused on being correct. It didn't matter if you were correct. It was an irrelevant interjection, and your response was ultimately disappointing. To be blunt, I feel like this video was simply rushed and not well thought out. Not only due to how it came out in as little as 24 hours, your responses felt like first impressions of you misunderstanding Starmic's first stats blurb, and had a bit of an overly defensive air to it. When it comes to responding to people, you must always be wary of your first viewing, and just let it sit with you for some time. Is it possible for you to have your impressions be valid on the first viewing? Yeah? But with the extra time, you can iron out your issues with their argument and perhaps come off more concisely. You should also avoid making declarations like accusing someone of intellectual dishonesty and peddling pseudoscience when you haven't put in the work to show that. And yes, stupid people believe stupid things, and if you want to commentate on them, you have to argue them. F1, I believe you can make fine work. Your co-op with Flagship Light is up in my favorites of the year, but this was just not a good video in my eyes. It happens. Just take all of this into consideration. I prefer seeing as many people thrive in our community as possible, so I hope this finds you well. As for the rest of you, I have other projects to work on and assist with, so I'll be off. Have a great day and take care.